All right, so today Steve is sponsoring the shir in honor of his father's yahrzeit, Chaim Yosef ben Yechiel Michal Halevi. His neshama should have an aliyah. He should be a meltz yosher for his family, for all of us, and all of Klal Yisrael. We are sponsored throughout this Masechta by A.B. Spry for the safety of our brave soldiers and for the safety of Klal Yisrael. We are also sponsored by Shimon Klein, L'ilui Nishmas Asher Anshel ben Yehuda and Gittel by Shimon Pinchas by Irving Fishbaum, for Isser ben Razel and his brother Eliezer ben Razel. We learned from Aishver, Avigdor Aye ben Rivka and Meir ben Chayesara. We welcome in Eddie Chazan, Ben Zion Cohn, Yitzi Fuchs, Irving Fishbaum, Mel Zachter, Stephen, Mark Frankel, Shalom Fogel, Shimon Klein, Marshall Castle, Nachman Chaplin, Michal, Shimon Deer, Aaron Swade, A.B. Spry, Rabbi Kranz, Shelley Zeitlin, Moshe Lehman, Ilya Shutman, Yitzi Muller, Pesach Ziegelman, Naftali Javelin. Here in the shul we have Reb Blumenfeld and Berish, and we have Rich and Saba and Ruvain Shannon, Reb Kraus and Reb Avram. If you remember, we talked about whether where Yitz and Irving gave testimony, and then Ruvain and Shalom, Mark and Shalom came, that they couldn't have given testimony on that day because on that day they were with Mark and Shalom in Atlantic City having a ball. So the question was, at what point do Yitz and Irving become disqualified as Eidim Psulim? So Abaya says it's retroactive to when they gave their testimony, because at that point they are proven to be liars and they're apostle Eidos, and therefore any documents that they signed in the interim would be invalidated. Rava says no. Rava says it's only from the time that Mark and Shalom gave their testimony. Why? Because Eidim Zaymimim is a chiddush. Because really it doesn't really make sense that we should believe Mark and Shalom more than Yitz and Irving. It's 2 against 2. And since it's a chiddush, ein lach ela mechidushay ve'elach. We only have from the chiddush and onward, and therefore they're only disqualified from the time that Mark and Shalom gave the testimony. Now, there's a second version over here, 2 lines from the bottom of Ayin Beis Amid Beis. Ikadamre, Rava Nami Kabaya Svirale. Rava also holds like Abaya that Lamafreya hu nifsal. So that when Irving and Yitz gave testimony on Rosh Chodesh Shvat that Jay was a crook, and then Mark and Shalom said that they were in Acapulco in Rosh Chodesh Shvat, so they couldn't testify about Jay, and they made their testimony in Rosh Chodesh Adar a month later. Even Rav agrees that Yitz and Irving should be disqualified retroactively. That they should be disqualified retroactively. However, when it comes to documents that they signed in the monetary arena, we don't disqualify them retroactively, because if we do so, we'd mess up a lot of innocent people. The reason of Rava is mishum seida lekuchos, because of the loss of the buyers that in the interim, during the whole month of Shvat, had Irving and Yitz sign for them. Now they'll be left without any proof, and they don't deserve to lose out. Says the Gemara, my beinai, what's the difference between Rava's reason in the first version and Rava's reason in the second version? The difference is where it's not a chiddush. Da'asidu beitrei lechad utrei lechad, where two witnesses testify that Yitzi was in Acapulco, and two witnesses testify that Irving was in Acapulco. Then that's not a chiddush, and then even Rava would agree that it would be retroactive in all situations. Inami de paslinu begazlanusa, or it's not that Mark and Shalom came and said that Irving and Yitz were in Acapulco, because then it's 2 against 2. What Mark and Shalom came and said is that Yitz and Irving were disqualified from testimony because they're thieves, or they gamble, or any other way that we disqualify them. So then it's not 2 against 2. So so this wouldn't be a chiddush. Then there would be no reason not to disqualify it retroactively, even according to Rava. That there's a loss to the buyers. There still is a loss to the buyers because they depended on them for their signatures the entire month of Shvat, and it's not fair that they should lose out. Amar Rab Yirmiyah Medifti, Avad Rav Papa Uvda Kavase de Rava. Rav Papa did a psak, an actual decision, like Rava, because, usually we pass like Rava. Rava's the Basra, and most of the time when he argues with Abaye, we pass like Rava, that they're not disqualified retroactively. But Rav Ashi Yama Hilchas Kavase de Abaye, in this case, the halacha is like Abaye. The Hilchas Kavase de Abaye, indeed, the halacha is like Abaye in 6 places in Shas when he argues with Rava, which is known by the famous acronym Biyal Kigam, and the ayin of Yal Kigam stands for Edim Zaymimim. So the halacha is like Abaye that the witnesses are disqualified retroactively. Now, Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Gonav al Pishnayim, now that we have our trusted thief back in place. Is he? Where is Marshall?
I'm in my truck.
What are you doing in your truck? Is it snowing?
No, I'm driving home. I was just at my shul cooking. Now it's time to go sit down in a nice warm chair and listen to the shiur. Fiddle.
Okay.
I'm always up to stealing something. I just stole something. Don't worry. You'll figure out what I stole.
No, I know what you stole. Let's learn about it.
Okay.
So, Tanan, Gonav al Pishnayim. If Marshall stole from Abi on the testimony of 2 witnesses, that's Yitz and Irving, and he slaughtered and sold it by their testimony, and we find that Yitz and Irving were false witnesses, they couldn't have testified because they weren't in Chicago at that time. They were in New York. Oh, thank you very much. They were in New York. They were in New York, so the din is Mishalman Esakol. The Yitz and Irving have to pay everything. They have to pay the kefil, they have to pay the dalad v'hei, because we do to them what they plotted to do to Marshall. Now, my love, isn't it talking about She'idu ala Gneva, that they testified, Yitz and Irving testified that Marshall stole it, v'chazu v'hi'idu ala tvicha, and then they testified that Marshall slaughtered it, v'huzmu ala Gneva, and then 2 witnesses, that's Nachman and Dr. Guy, came and testified that Yitz and Irving couldn't have testified about the theft because they weren't in Chicago. V'chazru v'huzmu al atvicha. And then they proved them that they couldn't testify about the slaughtering. But v'isol kedaitach l'mafreya hu nifsol. But if we say, like Abaya, that they're rendered disqualified retroactively, so that means they were already rendered disqualified when they gave the testimony about the theft. So then they weren't eligible to give the testimony about the slaughter. Hani kevan di tazmulu agneva, since they were proved to be false about the theft, igloi milsul mafreya, the chia asidu atficha, when subsequently they gave testimony that Marshall slaughtered it, psulanav, they were already pasul edus, and their edus is null and void. So then amai mishalman atficha, so then they couldn't have given good testimony. So then why would Yitz and Irving have to pay for the slaughter? They were already disqualified beforehand and they weren't eligible for testimony. Says the Gemara, you're right, we'll have to change the chronological order. What happened is first is that Nachman and Dr. Guy came and said that Yitz and Irving couldn't have testified about the slaughter because on that day they weren't in Acapulco. So the Gemara says, yeah, but Imre, saif, when subsequently they come and say that they couldn't have testified about the theft because they weren't in Chicago then either, Ki hadre mitazme agneva, once again, igloi milsa, it reveals retroactively the chi asidu atvicha, at the time that they gave the testimony on the slaughter, they were already disqualified witnesses. Psulanavi, so they weren't eligible, so there shouldn't be a payment of hazama for the slaughter. Amai mishalmi atvicha. So the Gemara says, you're right, it has to be where it happened at the same time. And that is that on Reish Chodesh Shvat, Yitz and Irving said that Marshall slaughtered it and Marshall stole it and slaughtered it. And Nachman and Dr. Kai come and say, you couldn't because on Reish Chodesh Shvat you weren't in Chicago, you were with us on a cruise in the Bahamas. They gave testimony at one time, and they were huzmu at one time, and that's why they would have to pay for the Yitz and Irving would have to pay the full amount, 4 times for a sheep or 5 times for an ox. So now the Gemara tries to show that this is actually a machloikis tanoim, this question of whether it's a mafrei or mekanu laba.
I'm back on my computer. Can you let me in on that?
Yeah, sure. Hold on.
Thank you. And also, where are we holding on the daf?
We are holding in Tallahassee.
Acapulco.
We're holding Ayin Gimel Amid Aleph in the middle, in Bavli, about 32 lines from the top.
Marshall, Lema Ketanai.
So the Gemara says, Lema Ketanai, let's say that this question of whether Adam Zaymim Apostle Mikana Laba or Lamafreya is totally in the following Machloikis Tanoi. Hoyushnayim Ma'idin Oisoi Shaganav. So here, Irving and Yitz testifies that Marshall stole from Abi. Vehein Me'idin Oisoi, and they also testify Shetavach, that he slaughtered it. V'huzmu ala gneva, and then they were Dr. Guy and Nachman came and said they couldn't testify about the theft because they were with us in Acapulco that day, so they weren't in Chicago. So then Eda shebatla miksasa batla kula. Then we say that the rest of the testimony falls apart. Why? Because Yitz and Irving said that he also slaughtered it, but that's meaningless if we didn't prove that Marshall stole it. So if Marshall didn't steal it, then his slaughtering could mean he slaughtered his own stuff. So therefore, once we disprove Irving and Yitz about the theft, so they're going to have to pay kafel to Marshall, but the testimony about the slaughtering just falls aside. Huzmu ala tvicha. On the other hand, if their testimony about the theft is upheld, and Nachman and Dr. Guy just say, well, you couldn't have testified about the slaughtering, because on that day you were with us on a cruise, so in that case, who mishalm tashlumei kefil? Marshall has to pay kefil for stealing it from AB. He has to pay kefil. Veheim and Yitz and Irving mishalmim tashlumei shleisha. They have to pay 3 or 4 to Marshall because they wanted to deprive him of that. And the fact of the matter is that in that they were muzam by Nachman and Dr. Guy. Amar Rabbi Yossi. So now Rabbi Yossi complicates the matters. That's only if it was 2 sets of witnesses. That means that Yitz and Irving testified about the theft, and Mark and Shalom testified about the slaughter. Aval be'edus achas, but if it's 1 set of witnesses, then we say edus shebatla miksasa batla kula. Then we say that an edus that part of it falls apart, the whole thing falls apart. So now the Gemara says, what does this mean? My b'shtei edus or my be'edus achas. Ilema, if you mean like I just said, that b'shtei edus means b'shtei edus mamish, 2 different sets of witnesses, that Irving and Yitz testified about that Marshall stole it. If b'shtei edus means b'shtei edus mamish, b'shtei kitais, be'edus, b'shtei kitais, 2 groups, that Irving and Yitz said that Marshall stole it, and Mark and Shalom say that Marshall slaughtered it. And be'edus achas, when it says 1 witness, it means babas achas, it means bekat achas, it means 1 group, Irving and Yitz. Bezeh achazeh, and they're coming one after another. V'amar Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi is saying, be'edus achas, if it's 1 set, that Irving and Yitz first testified that Marshall stole it, and then on the next day they testified that Marshall slaughtered it, and the Amar Rabbi Yossi be'edus achas is bekat achas b'zeh achazeh ki misadei agneva. If they testified that Marshall stole it on Sunday, v'hader misadei atficha, and then they testified that Marshall slaughtered it on Monday, ki mitazmei atficha, when they are made zaymamin on the tficha, on the slaughter, and Nachman and Dr. Guy said, well, you can't have testified that he slaughtered on Monday because on that day you are not in Chicago. Eda shebatla miksasa batla kula, that we should say that the edus that part of it falls apart, the rest of it falls apart. Vitazme lu agneva, and they should be also disproven about the theft. Why? Even if we prove that they were on Monday liars, that doesn't mean on what Marshall said on Sunday. Even if we prove that Irving and Yitz were liars on Monday, that doesn't mean that what they did the day before, that they're also liars. Elalav, it has to be talking. This gets very confusing, Rabbi Isai. It's really stretching our minds. Elalav, b'shtei idyus, means be'edus achas, one set of witnesses, ke'ein shtei idyus. It means, when it says edus achas, it means one set of witnesses, ke'ein shtei idyus, which is like two sets. U'ma'ninhu kat achas b'zeh achazeh. When you have one set, Yitz and Irving, but they did it one after another. Aval be'edus achas, bebas achas, where Yitz and Irving gave testimony, and it was at the same time. That means that Toich K'dei Dibur, they said that Marshall stole it and slaughtered it. There, loy. There, we do not say it. Why? V'savrua de kuli alma Toich K'dei Dibur K'dibur dami. That saying something within the time it says to say Shalom Alecha Rebbe Yomi, saying something right next to each other, is as if you said it at one time. So my lab behov kamifli. The Rabbanan Savrei, the Rabbanan hold, Mikanu lahabohu nifsa, that when Dr. Guy and Nachman say that Irving and Yitz cannot testify that it was slaughtered, because at that moment they were with us. So they're only testifying about the slaughter. And since they don't get disqualified retroactively back to the time that they said it, so therefore they could only be mazim them on the slaughter itself, and not on this, and not on the stealing. The kaven the mahi shot the kamitazme. It's only at that moment when they said that it was slaughtered that they said we saw them in the next room. Atvicha de kamitazim itazim, on the slaughtering that they said that they're edim zaymim and they're edim zaymim. Agneva de loimitazme, they didn't say they were in the next room when they said that Marshall slaughtered it. Loyitazim. But Rabbi Yossi savala mafreya hu nifsal. Rabbi Yossi says that it's retroactive. Now, if it's retroactive, that means when they said that Marshall was a liar when he said that Irving and Yitz were liars when they said Marshall slaughtered it, and we go retroactively to the time that they said it, that they're puzzled. And since Toich K'dei Dibur, they also said Marshall stole it, and Toich K'dei Dibur K'dibur dami, so then they were puzzled then too. The kaven the miyad ki asadu the mifsali, since immediately when they gave the testimony they're disqualified, ki atazmulu atvicha, when they become disqualified at the time that they said that Marshall slaughtered it, itazmulu nami agneva. They become disqualified when they said Marshall stole it, because they said the two things within Shalom Alecha Rebbe Yomi, da Toich K'dei Dibur K'dibur dami. So therefore, it would depend then on the machlokes whether we say l'mafreya or l'mekanu l'haba. So the Gemara says no, we don't want to. Since the established halacha is that we go l'mafreya, we want to learn both the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi l'mafreya, retroactive. Rather, it says the Gemara, the machlokes is just whether we say Toich K'dei Dibur K'dibur dami or not. And that's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, Amrei, if words that were said within Toich K'dei Dibur within the time, without a gap of Shalom Alecha, Rebbe Yomi, the Kuli Alma Lamafreyahu Nifsal. Everybody will hold that it's retroactive, and therefore when Nachman and Dr. Guy said that Yitz and Fuchs were in the other room when they said that it was slaughtered, therefore they're retroactively disqualified from that time, and therefore, since they said within Toikidei Dibber that Marshall also stole it, they would be puzzled for that too. But Elahacha b'Toikidei Dibber Kedibber Dami Kamiflagi. Rabbanan Savid, Rabbanan hold Toikidei Dibber Lav Kedibber Dami. So even though we retroactively disqualify Yitz and Irving from the time they said that Marshall slaughtered it, but that doesn't automatically get attached to what was said beforehand that Marshall stole it. Even though it's Tekadei Dibba, they hold Tekadei Dibba, Lav Kedibba Dami. Rabbi Yaisi Sava Tekadei Dibba, Kedibba Dami. So now the Gemara says, is that Rabbi Yaisi's opinion? Is that Rabbi Yaisi's opinion in Shas? Says the Gemara, V'sava Rabbi Yaisi Tekadei Dibba, Kedibba Dami, that which is said in the proximity of Shalom Alecha, Rebbe Yomi, is considered one with what's said afterwards. Vatanan, now here we have a famous Gemara that's cited in many places in Shas. Only somebody, we have to pick somebody who would think of such a thing. It's very hard to know. Okay, I have to take off my hat. Marshall. Okay, now I picked it out. I had everybody's name there.
I think it's good to have Marshall back.
Yeah. By the way, when I was reading Mar, I thought it was saying Mark, but it said Marshall.
He wants you to pick him. Or go for it.
So anyway, what happens over here is Marshall has a animal of kach. Excuse me. Marshall has an animal in front of him, and he says, "Harizu tmuras oila tmuras shlomim." It should be an exchange for an oila and an exchange for a shlomim. Now you'll right away say, if you have any inkling of kachim, it can't be an oila and a shlamim. An oila and a shlamim are completely different karbanas. An oila is kula kalul on the mizbeach. A shlamim, there are portions for the kayin, for the mizbeach, for the bailim. So Rameir holds twice lashon rishon. We go after the first thing, and it's a tmuras oila. But Rabbi Yaisi says, if he had in mind it should be both, and you can't say both in one breath, so we say that he meant that it should be an oila and a shlamim, and what that means is you should take this animal, let it graze until it gets a mum, sell it, and buy from the proceeds an oila and a shlamim. So let's see it inside. And let's see what this has to do with Toikadei Dibber Kedibber Dami. So the Gemara says, Matanan, Harizu Tmuras Oila, Tmuras Shlamim. This should be an exchange of an Oila, an exchange of a Shlamim. So Harizu Tmuras Oila. Rameir says simply twice lashon rishon, and it's an exchange for an Oila. Div Rameir. Rabbi Yaisi Aimer. Rabbi Yaisi says, first we ask him what he meant. And if he said he meant both, Im lekach nischava mitchila, since it's impossible to say them both at the same time, Devarav Kayamim. However, if he said it should be an exchange for an Ayla, and he changed his mind for Amar Tmur Shlamim, and it should be an exchange for a Shlamim, Harizut Tmur Ayla. So the Gemara says, well, of course, you can't change your mind. There's no backsies on Karbanas. Change your mind. Pshita. You can't change your mind. Once you declare an animal a Tmur Ayla, you can't change your mind. It means even if he changed his mind within the time it takes to say Sham Alecha Rebbe Yomairi. So the Gemara says, so you see from the fact that Rabbi Yossi holds that you can't change your mind, even if it's Taikadei Dibber, so it would seem to be that Taikadei Dibber Lav Kedibber Dami. So how could you say Rabbi Yossi holds that Taikadei Dibber is Kedibber Dami? Says the Gemara, there's two types of Taikadei Dibber Kedibber. Imrei, Trey Taikadei Dibber Ave. One is Kedei Sheilus Talmud Larav. One is the way a Talmud speaks to his Rebbe. That's a longer period, because that's Shalom Alecha Rebbe Yomairi. The Chad Kedei Sheilus Harav LeTalmud, where he just says Shalom Alecha. So Kiles later Rabbi Yossi. When does Rabbi Yossi hold that we don't say Taikadei Dibber Kedibber? That's if it's Kedei Sheilus Talmud L'Rav. That's if it's a lengthy forward interruption. Shalom Alecha Rebbe Yamari, Dinafish, that's too much. And then you can't say that it was in time to change your mind. But Kedei Sheilus Harav LeTalmud, Shalom Alecha, there you could change your mind. There we say Islay. There we say Taikadei Dibber Kedibber. Now, one thing I want to tell you, Rabbi, say it's good that we got over the easy Gemara first. This Gemara really stretches us. It's really something. It's
a very scary laugh.
Now, it's interesting. Shelley, this Gemara gave birth to the article we did to this morning. Because when I finished preparing the daf, I was so tired that I didn't have the strength to do the chok. I said, if I don't have the strength to do the chok, let me prepare an article. And I spent a good hour preparing that article. We did a wonderful article this morning on Ritzei, which will be in this week's Jewish Press and the Lakewood Shopper and the Views. I'm assuming you have it ready for me, Shelley?
I've gone through it once. I'm stumbling over a few parts, so I'll probably send it to you to clean up some of the sentences because I can't make sense.
If you don't know, Rabbi Isai, for many, many years, how long is it already, Shelley?
24 or so.
24 years. For 24 years, I've been dictating to Shelley my articles, whether I'm in the car or standing on my head or in a flying saucer, and he takes the dictation and he polishes it up, and then he sends it back to me, and I make my corrections, and then Shelley sends it into the different newspapers, and many of the things that we did. And Shelley, you took dictation of most of Power Benching, no?
Virtually all of it.
Virtually all of Power Benching.
All of it.
You didn't.
That explains the typos, Shelley.
The typos are mine.
Shelley,
The diction is mine.
Shelley, you weren't involved with Passionate Judaism.
Absolutely.
You were?
Passionate Judaism was a compilation of 20 or so articles.
I don't think so. I remember typing Passionate Judaism myself.
You think?
Meaningful Living was a compilation. Meaningful Living, Challenging Times. Anyway,
Yeah.
when I was writing Passionate Judaism, Yaakov wasn't bar mitzvah yet.
I remember writing articles about Nehemiah's and Menachem and the Yaakov's bar mitzvah. if I'm not
Right,
mistaken.
that's later. Yeah.
Well, Hashem, Shelley hasn't been replaced with AI yet. Are you sure
AI.
we're looking at AI right now?
I'm using AI.
You know, I want to tell you something, Rabbi Say. I ran across a halacha, a simple brachas halacha, that I didn't know offhand. Last week, my wife and I did a week of a certain cleansing diet. We did it together. We did a week without carbs. And it had somebody made a whole diet, and part of it was 2 snacks. And one of the snacks was 10 grapes and 8 cashews, or 5 hazelnuts, or 10 walnuts. So I had grapes and cashews, and then afterwards I made an al ha'etz, because on the grapes you have to make an al ha'etz. And then I wasn't sure if I had to make a bar nefashis, because the al ha'etz covers the cashews are also grown from a tree. On the other hand, you don't make an al ha'etz on the cashews. So I wasn't sure if I should make a bar nefashis on the cashews. I really wasn't sure. So I drank a cup of water, and I made a shakel on the water, and I made a bar nefashis on the water. And my son Simcha was here, so I said, I don't have time. Do me a favor, check it up, and tell me if you find it in the Mishnah Berurah. And in Siman Reish Ches, Siv Ches, the Mechaber Paskins, it's beferish in Shulchan Aruch, that although the nuts are not choshev enough for an ala eitz, but if you eat one of the shiva minim and you make an ala eitz, you don't make a separate bar nefashis. It's enough in halach in Shulchan Aruch. Anyway, I know Marshall loves these halachas, anything to do with food.
Like I said, hot dogs, please.
You're just trying to make me jealous. Now,
I share.
Amarava. Eidim shehuchashu ulebesayf huzmu. This is an interesting halacha. If let's say Yitz and Irving said that Chatzkel killed somebody. And then Michal and Rabbi Kran said that he didn't. They said that we saw Chatzkel that day learning in BMG. So they didn't make Yitz and Irving Eidim Zaymimim. They said that they contradicted their testimony. But then witnesses came and said that Irving and Yitz were in a different part of the planet. So they're put to death. The hachasha, because the contradiction is tchilas hazami, is the beginning of the hazama process, because the idea is they're contradicted. Obviously, if they're in a different part of the planet, that means that Chatzkel was probably not the killer. So first, Rabbi Kranz and Michal contradicted them, and then Dr. Guy and Nachman said that they were with us in Acapulco. So tchilas hazami ala shaloi nigmar. You don't have to look at it that way. You could look at it that no, once their edus was contradicted, it's 2 against 2. We don't listen to them, so then there's nothing to be mezim anymore. But we don't say that. So Amar Rava mina aminullah. How do I know this? Titania, for we learned in the Brisa. Now this gets very confusing, Rabbi Singh. Let me remind you that an Eved goes free. It's talking about an Eved Kanani. Marshall has an Eved Kanani. The Eved goes free if Marshall knocked out his eye or knocked out a tooth. Now let's say Marshall knocks out his tooth and then knocks out his eye. So then he goes free, and then Marshall has to pay him for his eye. Because now he's a free man and he knocked out a free man's eye. It would be better for Marshall if he knocks out his eye first and then knocks out his tooth. Because then he only has to pay him for a tooth, even though nowadays that's not so cheap either. But it's not as expensive as an eye. So now let's see what the Gemara says over here. The Tanya. Me'idani be'ish ploini. Here, Irving and Yitz come and they say, we testify about Marshall, shesime es ein avdai, that he blinded his Eved's eye, v'hipel es shinai, and knocked out his tooth. Shari arav aimer kain. The master also says that. V'nimtzu zaymamin, and Yitz and Irving are found to have been in a different place. They weren't in Chicago. Mishalmin dnei ayin le'eved. They pay the value of the eye to the servant. Now this doesn't make sense. Hey Chidami, what's the case? There is no subsequent testimony. Mishalmin dnei ayin le'eved. Why should they pay the eye to the Eved? They wanted, Yitz and Irving wanted to do the Eved the great service of freeing him. Basa de Mapkele, after they free him, they free him from servitude, he wants the value of his eye. Furthermore, since Yitz and Irving wanted to deprive Marshall of his Eved unlawfully, the Eid, to make Kule Eved l'Rabba Yishlume, they should have to pay the full value of the slave to Marshall because they wanted to deprive him unlawfully of his slave. The Eid, Shari Arav Aimer Kain, why should Marshall be happy about this? Harav Minechale, why should Marshall be happy? Rather, it's talking about that there's two sets of witnesses here. Elalav kigain to asu beitrei. Irving and Yitz came, the Imre hippel es shinai sima es einai. They said that Marshall knocked out his tooth and blinded his eye. And therefore they wanted to be mechayev Marshall to free the slave and pay him the value of the eye. The boil meisav leharav d'mei einai. That Marshall should have to pay for the eye because he goes out free with the knocking out the tooth and he has to pay the eye. V'asu beitrei mitzeh, and then Michael and Rabbi Kranz comes and they say the Imre, and they say einai v'hader shinai. It was the other way around. That first Marshall knocked out the eye and then knocked out the tooth, thereby only being mechayev Marshall to pay for the tooth. And that's why it says, and Marshall wants that also. The kamachish le kamay, let me say, the testimony of the original ones is contradicted by the middle ones. The master wants that it should be first that he knocks out the eye and then the tooth. He would rather pay only for the tooth and not for the eye. If the middle one is found to be zaymimin, that means if the middle one that says the eye first and then the tooth is found to be zaymimin, and really it was, therefore now like the first one say, it was the tooth first and then the eye. So they wanted to deprive the Eved of getting the payment of the eye. Mishalmim d'mei ayin le'Eved. They have to pay the value of the eye to the Eved. And we see over here that even though the middle one was first contradicted, afterwards, when we're mazing the middle one, we say that it has the din of zaymimim, and we say that the hachosha, the contradiction, is tchilas hazama. And shmami noah hachosha tchilas hazami. We see that hachosha is the beginning of hazama. So tomorrow, when we continue this sugya, we're going to have the hard job of reviewing it, but that's good, because we want to review it to make sure that we know it. We're going to stop over here and do the Mishnah Yomis. Yes. Oh, there's Passion Judaism. That's a great book.
Can I ask a question, or better to...
No, now we're going to do the Mishnah Yomis because they're waiting me to come also to Gedalia's Vart. Let's do the Mishnah Yomis now, Rabbi Yisai. Let's see, this was 73.